Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast brought to you by Bangalore International Centre, where we present conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
The aftermath of Blue Star is very telling because two or three things happened which are crucial. General Vaidya superseded General Sinha, which by itself is a big deal. And if you read General Sinha's biography, he's gracious enough to have taken his supersession and stepped away. But he talks about these things. And he talks about how, the constitution is supreme and governments ought not to run away with it, etc., which is taking you into new turf of civil-military relationships. The other thing is the assassination of General Vaidya, which is again a big deal, right? The assassination of a chief in Pakistan will bring the house down. And thirdly, a direct outcome was the assassination of Prime Minister Gandhi herself, Indira Gandhi, which was again directly related. And the point is, as I say, these have now become sort of factoids in our larger history. But they could have upset the apple cart. But you're right, by then I think the realization was there that this sort of thing doesn't happen here. Call it a tradition, if you will. Also, yes, factored with the size, and people have argued this, saying that the size of India also made it unwieldy. But one can never tell because there's never been an attempt at it, right? So was that a factor or not really becomes then academic.
In his book, Poles Apart, The Military Democracy in India and Pakistan, Aditya Sondhi delves into the starkly different roles played by the military in the political landscapes of India and Pakistan, and how these choices have shaped the democratic trajectories of both nations. While Pakistan's history is marked by frequent political interventions that have hindered its democratic development, India's military has remained notably apolitical, even in moments of crises such as the 1962 Sino-Indian War, the Emergency, and Operation Blue Star. Together with journalist Anohita Majumdar, the author will explore the critical moments where India's military could have intervened but chose not to, contrasting with Pakistan's history of military dominance in politics. The discussion will also include insights into Bangladesh's unique experiments with democracy and military rule. This discussion offers a rare opportunity to understand how the military's influence or restraint can define a nation's political destiny. This episode is adapted from an event that took place in the Bangalore International Centre in September of 2024.
I'm only going to make 4 short points before we go straight into the conversation with Anohita. I know she's waiting to have a go at me. Number 1 is the developments in Bangladesh more recently, and the fact that Sheikh Hasina didn't listen to her people, I think, is a message to leaders across the board. And I dare say for Mamata Banerjee, right across the border, that when students speak, when farmers protest, when young doctors protest, it's not always political. It may, of course, as is wont, be hijacked by certain vested interests within and outside, but those voices need to be listened to, and the vox populi can often reflect the ground realities that leaders are not willing to listen to. And as Bhutto's case shows in my book, and autocrats across the world have fallen when the people have not been listened to. Of course, that's not to say that the army has a role in any of these transitions, and we'll talk about it. The fact that in Bangladesh, the army chief oversaw the transition to Muhammad Yunus, who is himself not an elected leader, as qualified as he may be, speaks volumes that in crisis situations like this, Bangladesh seems to have inherited the traditions of Pakistan, that the army is never fully out of the picture. And that takes me to the second point I want to make, which is that for democratic governments, experimenting with the military, I think, is a dangerous proposition. There are certain well-established status quos which have prevailed, for example, in India, which I think should let remain. And when you tamper with the DNA, if you will, I used this word DNA at another talk, and A professor friend of mine gave me flack. She said it sounds a bit racist. I don't mean DNA in that sense at all. I mean a certain political DNA that we have institutionally ought not to be tampered with. So when you introduce something like, say, Agniveer, without the full understanding or collaboration of the military leadership, when you introduce AFSPA in states in India, when you bring in the army in an operation as sensitive as, say, Blue Star, then you're beginning to play with fire. And we'll talk about this evening as to how potentially there were scenarios where the army in India could have potentially, theoretically, gone the Pakistan way, but did not. But that's not to say that you take your democracy or you take an apolitical military for granted. You actually need to respect that status quo because it's not an accident. And that's the third point that I want to make, that there is a certain autonomy that institutions in India have enjoyed. That autonomy has been worked on over the decades. It's again not an accident. With that autonomy, at least as far as passive institutions like the Forge are concerned, that passivism ought not to be mistaken for indifference. That political passivism is a hands-off approach, which I argue in my book, creates political space for democratic institutions to grow. And that's certainly true of our earlier history. We may have achieved progress constitutionally, if you will, where the balance has shifted. You have a Supreme Court which declares what the Constitution is. You expect governments to listen. You certainly expect the armed forces to listen to those diktats. But that, again, is something we've worked on and not achieved overnight. And there is therefore much to be said about non-events in the Indian political history, especially when it comes to the non-event of a military coup. They also serve who stand and wait, who only stand and wait, I think, is a truism. And a fantastic book that I just began to read, in fact, after my book, I wish I had access to it earlier, is by this scholar called Maria Rashid. It's called Dying to Serve, where she speaks about the effect of soldiers killed in action in Pakistan and what sort of effect it has psychologically upon the families. And she argues that many of these families see the army as the sort of alter ego of the nation, right? So for them, it's not just an emotional loss. It's not a personal loss. And I'm sure to some extent it's true with us as well, that that loss is seen as a greater sort of sacrifice to a national good. But in Pakistan, it goes a step ahead. It is a sort of a symbiotic relationship that the common folk, many of whom are from rural Pakistan, share with the army in Pakistan still. And it's seen therefore as, the centerpiece of nationalism and therefore never really out of the picture. And therefore we need to be able to contrast exactly what has happened in Pakistan over the last 70 odd years to see how we've perhaps done better in our democratic example. And the last point I want to make is a more personal one. I have a cab driver friend in Abu Dhabi, actually. His name is Rashid Iqbal. He's from Pakistan, a newly sort of developed friendship. He's from a town called Gujarat, which I didn't know exists in Pakistan, but it's a town in Punjab. And it was a chance flagging down of a cab. We got chatting, aap kahan se hain? And he said, hum Lahore se hain. And then we started to speak in Punjabi, but obviously I'm Punjabi. I have to make that confession up front. And after a while, when he dropped me off, he said, "Twadde naal Punjabi gal karke dil nu khichda hai." In other words, speaking to you in Punjabi tugs at my heart. And the point I'm making here is that there's a certain connect that people have. We are a partition family. And that language is central in Pakistan. Apart from the personal connect that people to people have, and I think across both sides we've made much, more than much of our differences, disregarding many similarities and common histories. But politically, I think the point that Punjabi as a language and the Punjabis as a people in Pakistan are dominant belies many myths. People have assumed that Pakistan is a monolith Islamic state, etc. But it's actually far from the truth, as our conversation will show, that when it came to Bangladesh, the fact that the Bangladeshis or the East Pakistanis were Bengali speaking didn't sit well with the Punjabi dominant political class in Pakistan. So friends, with these introductory comments, I thank you once again for being here and look forward to the conversation.
So Aditya, I'll get straight into this. I was really curious about why you had actually picked this subject. I mean, obviously not just for the book, but for your PhD. Is there a connect in your family to the army, and is that what made you interested? Could you speak a little bit to that?
Really no direct connect to the army, but indirectly in the sense that my paternal grandfather was a civilian employee at the staff college in Quetta. And our dad, my sister's here, was born in Quetta, grew up there till he was 9 years old, and then moved across. So somewhere at the back of my mind, I think this unaccounted connection with Pakistan is still there, which I think most partition families feel, as do folks across the border who've crossed over. And we were talking about a play that I've written, which is actually set around partition and so on. But I think when it came to the PhD per se, the reasons were more my general interest in military history, and the fact that as much as I wanted to keep away from research in the law, that's sort of bread and butter, I still wanted to have some broad connect to the idea of the Constitution and constitutionalism. And therefore, I thought a topic of comparative politics, institutional politics, I think would fit the bill.
And you have delivered the Thimaya lecture on the Indian Constitution, which has also been printed. So that's another thing for people to read. The idea that India and Pakistan are completely different now seems so obvious that one perhaps doesn't stop to think why. Let's start with India. Do you think that the role of the army could have been different in post-independence India? Were there inflection points which could have made a difference?
Yeah, those points were indeed there, and I highlight about 6 or 7 of them within the first 10 chapters when there was a direct crisis almost in civil-military relations. And those included the pre-1962 episode when Krishna Menon, Nehru, General Thimaya, and others were really not able to find that happy middle ground. And those reasons are multiple. They were over operational matters, they were over matters of promotions, they were over matters of nepotism, and also importantly, the China threat, which unfortunately the civilian leadership didn't take seriously enough. And the 1962 debacle, in fact, proved it. And that sort of loss of face to the army in Pakistan, I think, would have almost 100% justified a political maneuver. So those instances were there, and as I mentioned, Blue Star, the emergency, the IPKF, which we can all talk about a little later, those instances were there. But I think in all of these periods of strain, when there was an arm wrestle between the civilian and military leaderships, not to mention the several supersessions that have taken place. India, at last count, has had about 30 supersessions at a chief level, whereas Pakistan has had 2. And that tells you something. The fact that the government can do that and get away with it also tells you that the military is probably not regarded as highly as it ought to be. Those points were certainly there, but I still don't think either the catalyst or the intent was there on the part of the military to go beyond. And I would dare say that was also the case with Pakistan up front. There was a revolt early in Pakistan's history, but that was, again, sporadic. And there really wasn't any posturing by the military in Pakistan, even in the early days. The invitation to the army and the imposition of martial law came from the executive. And that is really, for me, the crucial point, that in young democracies, the early leadership has to have a certain commitment to constitutionalism, must have a commitment to democracy and try and iron out those differences, however difficult they may be, through democratic constitutional means. And if you let the military through the door, then there's no turning back.
You've also, in your book, pointed to the fact that Pakistan did not have a constitution for many years. It was still operating under the Indian Act. So can you point to, I mean, we were one country, we inherited the same colonial structures, we inherited the same kind of leaders, perhaps. But in your book, you make a couple of points that perhaps the larger landholding class had more of an influence in Pakistan, the lack of a constitution, as I said, and even perhaps the leadership. Once the two countries were divided, there may have been a difference in the kind of leadership. In Pakistan, of course, the Pakistani leaders who were part of the anti-colonial struggle, but they were also waging a struggle for a different country. So perhaps that diluted the focus somewhat. Could you talk a little bit about the factors which led them on a different path?
Yeah, so as far as the colonial structures are concerned, Pakistan only made its first attempt with the Constitution in 1956, which was 9 years after its formation and 9 years too late, in my opinion, because within that time, martial law had already been imposed in 1953. Ayub Khan, who had quickly been promoted from brigadier to chief, was de facto calling the shots, and it was his coup in 58 that saw the army directly in power. So that constitution, for all practical purposes, was a non-starter. And I think the contrast there is crucial, because we had a commitment to a constitution up front. And we had our draft ready by 1949 and came into force in January 1950. And for the colonial baggage that we may have inherited, I think the Indian constitution went beyond it. It's surely not a colonial document. It tried to borrow from the best in the world. And importantly, you had a constituent drafting committee that was committed to trying to integrate the larger people of this country. And there was a leadership crisis too, I think. Jinnah was, in a way, the sole face for Pakistan. He was, in my opinion, a reluctant politician. To begin with, he was a very eminent senior counsel in Bombay, and not a very pious Muslim, so it's not that his commitment to Islam or politics was, is something he wore on his sleeve. But he got pulled in, and he was also a shrewd opportunist, and he found himself at that cusp of history where he was actually leading a new country. But he wasn't, I think, quite sure what sort of democracy Pakistan was meant to inherit. And it's really not for him or anyone to say, right? It's for the constitution to say. And he died early too. He died within a year or so of Pakistan's formation, and that created a huge leadership vacuum, which I think is, again, very important. India was fortunate to have multiple leaders. They were leaders who were, many of them were lawyers, trained and exposed to Western ideals of democracy, if you will, which they tried to bring in, coupled with a very unhealthy sense of threat from the army, which I write about. Nehru saw the early generals as threats. It's on the record, and he didn't see the army as a collaborator. Whereas in Pakistan, after Jinnah, Liaquat became the prime minister. He was a lawyer himself, a good man. He trusted Ayub, and that's something you'll see in the book. At every stage, the president or the prime minister handpicks an officer who becomes their bete noir, whether it's Musharraf or Zia or whoever. And he was assassinated. And after his assassination, the structure under the Government of India 1935 Act continued, which meant you had no elections. Pakistan had its first full and direct election in 1970, which is startling. And it's in that scenario, the absence of a constitution, the absence of tall leaders, the feudal politics of Pakistan, which is a reality, and the linguistic bit, which I tried to mention, the dominant, Punjab as opposed to, say, the Sindhi-speaking belt in Karachi or the Khyber Pakhtun and so on, and of course the trust deficit with East Pakistan. I think all of that was this cocktail which was tailor-made for extra constitutional solutions. And how quickly would have the army acted otherwise in Pakistan, I don't know. But as I say, they were invited. And once they were invited, two or three things happened which have stayed with Pakistan and I think stayed with Bangladesh also in a way, which is that A, they were seen as this nationalistic savior institution. They were seen as being more morally right than anybody else. And for the military leadership in turn, it meant they tasted power, right? I can't speculate and say how would Indian generals have behaved had they tasted political powers. I've argued that our officers remained in that British traditions of officers and gentlemen were apolitical, but it's not that the Pakistani officers were very different. They went to the same schools, they went to the same military academies, they inherited the same sort of etiquette, if you will, but having tasted power, having gotten deep roots in the economy, it was a sort of a fait accompli scenario that they would always stay.
So your book goes a little bit into something I find very interesting, the mention of the paramilitary forces which were set up by India. In Pakistan, as you point out, the leaders called on the army to quell unrest and discontent. But in India, a lot of the internal security operations have been carried out by the paramilitary forces. Can you give us a little bit of an overview of the paramilitary forces and their role here? Because that almost disappears from discussion.
Yeah, I think that's a very important facet of the civil military peacekeeping law and order apparatus in India. You have the police, which is under the control of the state to maintain law and order. You have the military, which is meant to protect you against external aggression. But then you have a lot of gray area in between, like AFSPA, for example, which we'll perhaps come to later. But the paramilitary are interesting because paramilitary is a combination of both the police and the military in many cases. In some cases, not. I'm not so concerned about the composition of the respective paramilitary forces because we have many. I think the control structure is more important to talk about. That paramilitary forces, regardless of how heavily they draw from, say, only the police or a hybrid like the Rashtriya Rifles, when it comes to the pure paramilitary forces, BSF, CRPF, CISF, etc., they're reporting to the Ministry of Home. And that's no accident. The intent is to have different, or the intent was at least, to have different layers of armed forces, whether you call them the pure military or the paramilitary, at your disposal. And this was shrewdly thought out, and this has been written about, that this was actually something that the Congress Party and Mrs. Gandhi deliberately did, leading up to the emergency, the formation of the BSF as a sort of a buffer, right? Should the army go rogue? And that experiment has continued. In fact, after Operation Blue Star, when ironically it was the army that was brought in and should not have been, you had the National Guard constituted, which later became the National Security Guard. And these are there to stay. But there is a motive, if you will, behind these buffers between the pure military and the paramilitary. And there's actually a comparison in Pakistan which cost Bhutto dearly, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. When he came into power, he himself mistrusted the army. And he had seen that the army had ruled the roost. He thought he was the first democratic leader, but he turned out to be perhaps their most autocratic one. And he tried to distance the army too by creating what he called the Federal Security Force, which was his own sort of paramilitary private security force almost. But he paid for it dearly. Whereas here, it's accepted as one governance decision.
I think some of these paramilitary forces were probably put in place even during the British times. For example, the genesis of Assam Rifles, or even AFSPA, its origins lie in pre-independence times. So was this also a separation that the British had made, which was later developed by the Indian government?
Not particularly, I think. From my research, the paramilitary really came more prominently into the national security picture around emergency and thereafter. And we've continued to sort of build on it. What we had inherited from the British regime, in fact, was our intelligence agencies. And that's a separate book in itself. The fact that Indian intelligence agencies have no constitutional framework, right? The IB and the RAW and other adjunct bodies are really tracing themselves to executive orders that were passed somewhere in the 1880s or so. And to have formidable forces like this, I can't obviously call them paramilitary, but the IB is comprised mostly of police officers at the senior level, right? And there are legal questions to be asked as to whether it is a police force, a paramilitary force, or a pure civilian agency. And the Constitution is silent on it. But I think quite consciously we went this paramilitary way, which is where, you know, when I look at something like Blue Star in particular, and the generals themselves have called it out, saying this was not an operation for the army. There was no business. You may have got it wrong with 1962, you may have got it wrong with Kargil, you may have got it wrong with the IPKF, which we did. IPKF operations in Sri Lanka are called the Vietnam of India. But there was never any political response from the military, despite being pushed into this sort of completely unclear battle zone. But Blue Star was something that could have gone horribly wrong. Because of the fact that the military was really not intended or meant for that operation. It was a purely internal matter. And more importantly, because of the religious sensibilities involved. And as I write, there was in fact, for perhaps the first time, a revolt within the army. I think 9 Sikh, many of the Jawans revolted. But that revolt was suppressed. There were no officers involved in it. And it gets, you know, it becomes a footnote in Indian history. But the point is, these were delicate scenarios.
Is it also the immense size of India? I mean, that keeps any of, you know, what could have been quite a critical moment after Operation Blue Star, and some senior officers did resign subsequently in protest. Could that have been a moment which would have changed the situation had we not been such a large and pluralistic country?
I think by Blue Star, which is 1984, we were so, I think, far gone that the idea of any political adventurism was really off the table. And this is where I pay tribute to the armed forces. The whole event, non-event of a coup is something we must give its due regard to. The fact that we stayed committed to this relationship of hierarchy where the civilian government ultimately knows best. And whether the military agrees or does not agree, those differences are expected to be ironed out privately. They are expected to be ironed out in a civil manner. And ultimately, you take it on the chin and move on, even if you don't like it. And by the time Blue Star happened, as delicate as it may be, and the interesting thing is that Bhindranwale's 2 key advisors were retired officers. They were both generals, General Bhullar and General Shabeg Singh. They were both major generals, retired. So they were obviously taking on a political avatar. They had no issues with it. But as far as the other side was concerned, in fact, the aftermath of Blue Star is very telling, because 2 or 3 things happened which are crucial. General Vaidya superseded General Sinha, which by itself is a big deal. And if you read General Sinha's biography, he's gracious enough to have taken his supersession and stepped away. But he talks about these things. And he talks about how, you know, the constitution is supreme and governments ought not to run away with it, etc., which is taking you into new turf of civil-military relationships. The other thing is the assassination of General Vaidya, which is again a big deal, right? The assassination of a chief in Pakistan will bring the house down. And thirdly, a direct outcome was the assassination of Prime Minister Gandhi herself, Indira Gandhi, which was again directly related. And the point is, as I say, these have now become sort of factoids in our larger history. But they could have upset the apple cart. But you're right, by then I think the realization was there that this sort of thing doesn't happen here. Call it a tradition if you will. also, yes, factored with the size, and people have argued this, saying that the size of India also made it unwieldy. But one can never tell because there's never been an attempt at it, right? So was that a factor or not really becomes then academic.
Related to the size, your book also has a chapter on AFSPA and its use, where the army comes out in aid of civilian authority. Now, because you've said, I think, in another discussion that, if the entire country was under AFSPA, for example, it would be akin to military rule. But because India is large and it happens only in certain parts of the country, but quite a substantive portion of our country is under AFSPA. What is the need for that, do you think, and what is the impact of that?
Yeah, so the AFSPA is really the Armed Forces Special Provisions Act, which entitles the central government by an executive order to declare a certain area as a disturbed area and then introduce the military in that state or in that disturbed area to maintain law and order, simplistically put. But there are...
And we have it in large parts of the northeast, in Punjab, in Kashmir.
Jammu and Kashmir, we've had it. It began in Assam and the northeastern states. It moved to Kashmir. It's been imposed in Punjab. It gets, interestingly, also withdrawn from time to time. And many times at the instance of the generals themselves or the officers themselves who advise that AFSPA is really not needed. But the point is it remains a political decision. But there are 2 or 3 elements to AFSPA which I think need to be talked about. One is just the constitutional position. AFSPA came before the amendment to the Constitution. The Constitution was amended way after AFSPA by insertion of Article 2A in List 1. I don't want to get too legal, but what it says is that the union government has the legitimate right to make law providing for military aid to civilian power. Loosely put, that's what 2A says. Now, aid to civilian power by the military in itself, in my opinion, is a misnomer. Not to say that the amendment came after AFSPA. AFSPA was challenged in the Supreme Court, it's been upheld. So it's law, it's legit. But the idea of bringing in the military in aid to civil power in matters of internal management is a very skewed concept, in my opinion, in the civil-military balance that we've had. Because you've tried to have this broad separation between the police forces, the paramilitary, and the army. And toying with that arrangement, it may have proven operationally successful in the states that you were dealing with. It has given rise to serious allegations of human rights violations, which is a separate issue to be dealt with. But I think from the larger concept of the role that the military plays constitutionally in India, I think AFSPA is an outlier. And as I say, it's in force in Manipur today, but we really don't even know what's happening in Manipur. But for the people who have their ears to the ground, that news hardly even percolates to us. But the example that I gave, imagine if you declared 9/10 of the country as disturbed. And then you had AFSPA in force, God forbid, in Karnataka or in Delhi. It would tantamount to military rule in a way. Not directly again, because it's not a general who's ruling the roost. It's still a political executive decision, no doubt. But the fact is that you're now creating a far broader role for the military that was never envisaged. And that, as a result, means the military gets drawn into matters beyond defense. And if you read a lot of writing on Kashmir, the manner in which AFSPA has been implemented takes it beyond matters of defense and peacekeeping. It's executive in many ways. It's really governance. The army is there. And as far as the common Kashmiri or the common citizen is concerned, the army is the face of the government. And that, as I say, again, in many ways, credit to the armed forces that despite this opening, and look, this is a collateral opening. The Indian Constitution does not provide for martial law. Let's be very clear. So the idea of military rule or martial law is alien to our constitution, as it was in Pakistan, by the way. When martial law was imposed in 53, there was really no provision, but the Supreme Court ratified it on the basis of necessity. But I think with AFSPA, though it has emanated from the civilian leadership, I still think there needs to be a greater deal of soul searching from the perspective of how it impacts civil-military relations going forward. And one last point, that the checks and balances with AFSPA also are far less. It's an executive order, right? It's an administrative order which brings the almost draconian measure of AFSPA into play. Now, if you compare it to the emergency provisions in our constitution, those have a much higher threshold, right? That goes to Parliament. This is an executive order. And you therefore don't want to be, if I may say, testing the waters with these sorts of structural changes unless you're completely sure that it's in larger public interest.
As you said that at times AFSPA has been withdrawn in places, sometimes even at the instance of the army itself. Is it, does the Indian Army really want to be out of the civilian areas, or does its perpetuation in these circumstances become a goal in itself?
You know, the official position on it is all I can comment on, because I'm not privy to anything behind the scenes. And there are veterans in the audience who will perhaps say their bit later. But from whatever I've read, the stated position, not only the official position, but let me say the semi-formal position which you can gauge from biographies and memoirs of generals and officers, is that, look, we never asked for AFSPA, and when the government asked us to withdraw, we withdrew. And in fact, General Padmanabhan, who recently passed, says in his book that there were instances where he himself advised the government to withdraw AFSPA, but the government paid no heed. That again, I think, is an important factor. Not paying heed to the general's advice in Pakistan is a sure shot self-goal, as many leaders have discovered to their dismay. But here is a general saying, I said so, but no one listened to me. So that's the official position. But how it plays out behind the scenes is hard to say. As I argue, if you're vesting the military with more power than is contemplated in the Constitution, then it's for you as the executive and the government to think long and hard about it. Because once you do it, then the shot is fired. And it can go any which way. I think we're perhaps fortunate that the collateral with AFSPA in this sense has still been low. The collateral, I think, on the human rights is a different question altogether. But I don't know if the civilian leadership was thinking about it. And what checks and balances and what guarantees did you have in place should things go wrong?
Let's come to Pakistan. I mean, the role of the army from very close to the inception, and your book really delineates, we know it, but you really bring out each of the circumstances and all the events in which, the army has stepped in to dilute civilian control. And sitting here, it looks like the army has always been in charge in Pakistan. But you make also the point that there have been shifts. There's a difference before 77 and after 77. Aisha Siddiqa, who I spoke to here in BIC some time ago, talks about the fact that now the army prefers indirect rule rather than direct rule, and that is perhaps far more insidious and dangerous. Can you trace for us a little bit the trajectory of the role of the army? Have there been distinct phases?
Yeah, so in the explicit sense of the army being in power, the compartments are very clear. That from 47 to 58 was that flux. You had martial law. The coup from Field Marshal Ayub came in 58, and he assumed power, and he stayed in power for almost 10 years. And he was interestingly overthrown by General Yahya Khan, his own man, if you will. And he
paradoxically, as is the case in Pakistan, is credited as being perhaps their most democratic leader. He's credited with having held the best and the freest elections leading up to the 71 election, which was the watershed when actually East Pakistan began to pull its weight. But post the loss in 71 was, I think, a watershed moment for Pakistan when it could have pulled back, because a lot of the legitimacy of the military in Pakistan comes from the people. It doesn't come from the constitution, really. It doesn't come from structures. It comes from a certain acceptance by people. For us today as a people, I think, however dissatisfied we may be with our democracy, the idea of a general in power is obnoxious. We just won't have it. But in Pakistan, 71 is a good 24 years into independence. The army was the mainstay and it was acceptable, it was credible. But the loss in 71, leading up from the loss in 65, told the common Pakistani that the army was busy doing other things. And that was the discourse. That, look, you should have been fighting and winning wars. You've been busy playing politics. And that was the sort of the sentiment on which Bhutto came into power. And that was how he made his pitch to India for the negotiations and to the world at large, saying this is actually the first tryst with democracy that Pakistan was going to have. And that could have actually turned the tide for them. But unfortunately, as I argue, neither were there democratic traditions in Pakistan, nor were there sufficiently democratic institutions. The courts were playing second fiddle. The media was critical to a large extent. But the leaders somehow, inherently, found themselves more dictatorial, more autocratic than the Faujis. And as a result, Bhutto was sentenced to death, and it was his bete-Nawaz Zia, who he had handpicked, who showed him the door. And after Bhutto went, that experiment with democracy unfortunately failed. And it failed so badly. There was so much violence, there was so much rigging of elections that the common Pakistani folk, perhaps with that 6-year experiment, said we were better off with the armed forces. And that led to Zia's return. That's, of course, when things turned in a different way, because the army and, in a way, the country got Islamized. By which time you had a new constitution. It was an Islamic Republic of Pakistan. Zia changed the motto of the army, which is, it's more than optics. When you change the motto, and he introduced, if I remember the last part of it, it says, Jihad fi Sabilillah, which means basically struggle in the name of Islam and of the Prophet. That changes the very signature of the armed forces. And it's not to say that the army by and large accepted it. There were still people with a sort of British type secular tradition who were uncomfortable. But that cost them. Many of them were passed over. People who were more loyal to Zia, who were seen as more puritanical and more religious, moved up quickly. And then thereafter, it's really been musical chairs. You had this decade of democracy, which is so, it's almost tragic, but it's fascinating. When Benazir was in power, General Nawaz was then in power. General Nawaz was regarded as the savior and a champion of democracy. The Western press in the history of Pakistan calls a general as the champion of democracy. How ironical is that? And that's when it went around. And in Pakistan, it actually goes around in threes, not even in twos, because they're still not clear to what extent is it parliamentary and to what extent is it presidential. So at any given point in time, you either have a president calling the shots, or you have a prime minister, or you have a general, or you have a general as the prime minister, as Musharraf showed us, and at times as the president himself. And that's the skewed experiment that Pakistan had that went on till the 90s. Then Kargil happened, Musharraf came back to power. And to quickly conclude, I still think that the last few years have been very interesting for Pakistan. And however one may see Imran, he's a very popular leader, right?
Though he started as someone who was seen as the army's...
A hybrid. Yeah, no doubt. He actually found his place because he had the army's backing. And I think that is a given in Pakistan. That is the
So has,
yeah.
you mentioned how there have been moments in Indian history where things could have gone otherwise. Have there been moments in Pakistan's history when the civilian leadership could have wrested back the control?
Yeah, so I think one, as I said, was Bhutto's time. Clearly, unfortunately, he didn't cultivate those democratic principles, and he didn't have institutions to back him. Benazir tried, she paid for it with her life. Nawaz Sharif, I'm ambivalent on, because he ultimately, I think, had a very selfish perspective to leadership. He had a business interest deeply entrenched, and that seemed to have dictated the way things went. He was perhaps shrewd enough also to know that you don't upset the apple cart too much, but he did that, and he paid for his post with Musharraf overthrowing him. But I do clearly think that thereafter, when the lawyers' movement, for example, happened, it was a strong grassroots movement, and that's perhaps what I should have also said in my introductory remark, that you must listen to the people, whether it's students or farmers or doctors or lawyers or civil society.
Especially lawyers, right?
Especially lawyers, yes. Thank you for that. That is the voice of the people, and that was a time, I think, when the relationship with democracy in Pakistan started to turn. The Supreme Court became more assertive. And as I say, Imran came to power on the back of the army's support, but he became his own man. And into his second term, he was clearly calling the shots. And even though he's out of power, you know that his colleagues won as independents, which I think is a very strong political statement. I think you have to give credit to the Pakistani electorate there, that they were able to say, we don't want the establishment anymore. Don't give us a hybrid democracy where your every set of leader is really a shadow for the ISI and the army. And the fact that they were able to support independence tells you that the churn is happening in Pakistan. But unfortunately, I think, and this takes me back to the fundamental point, that if you don't get off to a good start, then you're going to pay for it. And we have had these fissures in our country too, repeatedly. But we, I think, still have the shock absorbers to get back to the mainstream without having extra constitutional solutions. Whereas in Pakistan, unfortunately, that's never the case. The army is always lurking, and as Ms. Siddiqa rightly says, it's probably more ominous that they're behind the scenes, because they probably play more mischief that way.
I want to get to Bangladesh, but one more question on the Pakistan army. They have, of course, had a love-hate relationship with a lot of armed groups, some which have been used against India right from 47, and some which have been used to create trouble in Afghanistan. There are, of course, now a law unto themselves, so the army goes in to quell them, but again, part of the army or some groups are favored and supported. What is the impact of this? Is that also something which is, are they creating this also just to stay in power, apart from, what their goals vis-a-vis an enemy country like India?
Yeah, so 2 or 3 things here. One is, I think after 9/11, the role of the Pakistan army changed significantly. I think Musharraf felt obliged to toe the American line more than ever before. And as a result, some of the problems that the Pakistan army had created themselves in their borders with Afghanistan, they were now required to quell. And even as things stand today, the Pakistan army is being pushed back on those fronts, losing soldiers and officers on a daily basis. And in some ways, this is playing into a larger question as to, are you fighting your own people? And are you fighting your own religious comrades in a way? And that's creating a different identity crisis of its own, which is why, people had cautioned Mrs. Gandhi against bringing the army into Blue Star, because the moment you make the military don a religious hat, you're in trouble, because that can then percolate in different ways. But to the earlier part of your question as to the trouble that the army and the establishment, in a sense, creates in India overtly and covertly, I think that is the larger narrative. That whole India bogey, that India is the constant enemy, enemy number one, that India wants to undo partition, to reintegrate Pakistan into India, is the narrative on which the army has justified its existence, right? And for whenever things have gone bad for the army, their generals, and you might have seen in my book the ironies of the statements that each of these generals make when they come into power, saying the military has no business in politics, but look, we know best. And this is, yeah.
Can I interrupt to ask, could they have stayed in power with quite the same amount of strength, force, and longevity had it not been for example, American backing, which perhaps now is being replaced by backing from China and other friends?
Yeah, good question. I mean, look, American international policies are fairly inscrutable and they're very opportunistic. You know that Pakistan will back a general, for example, they backed Musharraf post 9/11 because they wanted the full force of that establishment. But equally so, when they felt Bhutto represents a return to democracy, they wanted to be the patron saints who brought democracy to Southeast Asia. When they were sick of him, or they were sick of Zia in some ways, people have said that Zia's death was no accident. I don't know, I can't corroborate it, but that's been the narrative. So yes, of course, I think that international support has been critical. China's relationship with Pakistan, I think, is a centerpiece and something to be talked about in the larger geopolitics for us and what sort of relationships we've built. But just to return to that point I was making, that entire India bogey is something we need to be careful about. It's one thing to say that we've done better, we're poles apart when it comes to our constitutional standards, fair point, but then that's hardly the comparison we want to be making. And it is also in our larger interest to have successful democracies around us, which we don't. We neither have strong relationships with our neighbors and nor do we have flourishing democracies. And with Pakistan, maybe it's not our business to enable a return to democracy, but it's equally not our business to feed this narrative. And I don't know, many of you would have seen that leading up to the last election, there were leaders going to town publicly saying that, we have to undo partition. However fanciful or casual that may be, in this day and age of social media, it gets picked up. And that gets picked up and becomes then the basis for the army to go to town. And look, the army has a very strong PR mechanism in Pakistan. Let's not forget that. They have deep economic interests and they have the media. And they know how to use it. And that then becomes the narrative for them to stay relevant.
So you talked about our neighbors and our relationship, which is a good point to get into Bangladesh. So clearly the army had a role. But also clearly the government of Sheikh Hasina was extremely undemocratic. And clearly you had some foresight, or your editor did, and you've added a chapter on Bangladesh to your book. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, first about the foresight, that credit goes entirely to Karthik. I thought I was done with my research and writing till one afternoon in Koshi's. I think many of my Koshi's friends are here, Prem is here. Koshi's, where else, where all the writing and the ideation happens. Karthik said, why not have a chapter on Bangladesh? And he was spot on. It's not that I personally saw this coming, but in the course of writing that chapter, which is a decent 10,000 word chapter, I was able to unravel Bangladesh's experiment. And it's a very unique, sui generis experiment, because Bangladesh inherited the baggage of West Pakistan. It inherited the military as the savior in some ways. It had long stints with generals in power, General Irshad, the other General Ziaur Rahman. But to Bangladesh's credit, their experiments with pure democracy have actually proven better than Pakistan's, especially in the last 20 years. And they've been with their elections in Bangladesh are very violent. They're, again, student-driven. Many times you're doing this different musical chairs there of caretaker governments, and it's a two-party race by and large. But with all that, Bangladesh was still able to at least push away from the military for a considerable period in time, which is longer than Pakistan ever. Secondly, do well economically. And thirdly, which was a real revelation to me, was the acceptance of NGOs, civil society movements, and a commitment to institutional collaboration, which are really the hallmarks, right, of a responsible democracy, with something for us to reflect on. But with all that, somewhere I do say in the book that, will this status quo prevail? And quickly you've seen how that house of cards has come down. And for that, the blame...
So what is your analysis of the role of the army in this situation? I mean, finally it was also a refusal to fire more on those protesters. And then it stepped away very quickly.
Yeah. In fact, I think the role of the military in Bangladesh in this particular episode has been minimal. That's my sense. I don't have enough feedback or knowledge to say that there's been a behind-the-scenes role. I do think that at its heart, this was really a student-led movement. There's no doubt it's been hijacked in 2-3 ways, right? It's been hijacked along religious lines, it's been hijacked along political lines, and some say it's been hijacked by intelligence agencies from both Pakistan and the US. I don't know how far that's true. The first two are there to see. But the blame here lies with the civilian leaders. These are things you could have corrected. Sheikh Hasina was popular, but she was also autocratic, led a very violent regime, oppressed and suppressed dissent brutally, and was still, I think, really didn't listen to the voice of the people. That's what I said. She brought in reservation policies which harked back to the role that people had played in the liberation of Bangladesh. Now, that's a very sensitive topic. She and her father were, of course, directly involved in that liberation process. She obviously has a soft spot for those, the Mukti Bahini, who fought. But I think in some ways she was tone deaf to the sentiment in Bangladesh, which equally pervades, which thinks that India was responsible for 1971, that Bangladesh should have never been spun off, and that there is a certain mothership that Pakistan is, with whom that connection should have remained. And as a leader, you're expected to take that into account. And look, there's one other point here, I may be slightly digressing, which is the decision in Bangladesh to have the Mukti Bahini integrated into the army. India consciously never did that with the INA, right?
And the Rokhi Bahini was also set up
Exactly.
by Mujib.
Yeah. And all of that in some ways has come back to haunt her. And that's where I think the presence of the army chief is unsettling. It speaks volumes. By all media accounts, the student leadership does not want the army to have the last word as it has done historically, which is a democratic principle. But that said, you have an unelected leader, you have an ad hoc transition, you don't have courts that are overseeing this transition, you have the army chief who's in a way blessing the new incumbent. And really what that means historically, both in Bangladesh and Pakistan, is that it's up for grabs. Now, today, perhaps in 2024, the military leadership, both in Bangladesh and Pakistan, has probably smelt the coffee and said, being there overtly is not the best policy. The tide has turned, there aren't many such examples worldwide. People know better, the youth have different demands, and they don't necessarily see the army as the savior. But that said, if you don't have a facility to constitutionally return to the mainstream, it's anybody's game.
My last question to you, I'll bring it back to India. What has the possibility of a larger army role, which could, I don't see a coup, but in some other form, is it even possible in India now? And you've mentioned briefly the politicization of the army. What does that mean for us?
Yeah, I do personally think we're past any potential threat of a coup. That's my gut feel basis my study. But that still doesn't discount the fact, and I began with that doesn't mean you take this for granted. It means that we cherish and nurture those ideals which have brought us this far, that we continue to feed institutional checks and balances, and importantly, we don't toy with the ethos of the military. It can work in different ways. It's actually played out in a very different way, I think, in the last few years. And there is that short chapter on 2008 and beyond, where I talk about how the Agniveer experiment, the CDS experiment, which was actually meant to be an ideal solution, it's proven to be anything but that. And this direct politicization by introducing selfie points, etc., which some of you may not be aware, it is actually a diktat to the troops that you have selfie points at particular spaces at your regiments or your units, where soldiers/officers are expected to go and speak positively, not about their role or their officers, but speak about the government. And that's really propaganda, for the want of a better word. That comes with a different advisory, which is that soldiers going back to their native villages are expected to talk about the good work being done. This is nothing but politics. And please, for God's sake, appreciate the fact that the army remained apolitical by choice. And what you take for granted today was not a given in 1958. And as Jairam Ramesh says in his book, when there's a coup in Pakistan, Delhi is on edge. It may not be on edge because the generals are doing anything. General Thimaia at the time, however tall and popular he may have been as a leader, he had no political ambitions. General Karyappa initially had something to say. He did a quick turnaround and stayed true to the apolitical side, as I write about. But Delhi was still on edge and saying, look, if this can happen in Pakistan, it can happen here. But fortunately, we dodged that bullet, right, for a multitude of reasons. And if you've come this far, you have problems galore of your own, as we do, why upset this apple cart? And that's where it takes me back to some of the writings of General Sinha and so on, saying this idea of civilian obedience. Whose orders does the military listen to? Is it the bureaucracy? Is it parliament through law? Is it the courts through their judgments? Or is it an interpretation of the constitution by the army leadership itself? And the last is the most problematic one, because that's exactly what Ayub and Zia used to say, our constitution expects us to hold fort, though it really doesn't. And that's where, if you've had this fine balance, where despite emergency and all of these crises that we've gone through, we've been able to somehow come back to a status quo without the army having to make a choice. Please don't go down that road where at some point the Fauj needs to make that choice.
You have been listening to BIC Talks by Bangalore International Centre. If you like what you heard, do follow us on social media. Keep up with our programming by signing up for our mailer on the website, or leave us a review or rating on Apple Podcasts or iTunes. The crew that makes these podcasts possible is Gaurav Krishna and Ishan Gupta on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarunaraj and Raghu Tenkaila. Artwork is designed by Chandni Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studio. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org. This is Lekha Naidu signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.